In 1775, at the battles of Lexington and Concord, the British colonies in North America rebelled, eventually leading to the independence of the United States of America. But famously, the British colonies to the north remained loyal, and in fact today are still members of the modern Commonwealth of Nations. But that narrative oversimplifies the relationship between Canada and Mother England, which, as with the colonies to the south, was often quite strained. And in 1837, after years of discontent over oligarchical rule, that strain would lead to open conflict. The Canadian rebellions of 1837 and 1838 were very different than the American Revolution, but they forced the British government to re-examine the administration of Canada, eventually leading to the creation of the modern nation that we know today. The Canadian War for Independence deserves to be remembered. In 1791, the Parliament of Great Britain passed the Constitutional Act of 1791, which replaced the Quebec Act of 1774 as the framework for governance in the province of Quebec. The act split the territory into two provinces: Upper Canada, comprising the southern portion of modern Quebec, and Lower Canada, comprising the southern portion of modern Ontario. The terms upper and lower were given based on the two regions' positions along the St. Lawrence River. The act had several goals. Thousands of United Empire loyalists who had left the rebellious colonies during the War of American Independence to resettle in British territory, immigrated to Quebec and Nova Scotia during and after the war. Parliament was encouraging immigrants to largely unpopulated Upper Canada and gave Upper Canada English law and institutions, while Lower Canada, populated by a large number of French speakers, retained French civil law and privileges for the Roman Catholic Church. The act attempted to establish support for the Church of England by establishing clergy reserves, land grants meant to support the church. 1/7 of the territory of both of the Canadas was sold for the benefit of the Church of England and later also the Church of Scotland. The act also created a form of representative government in each Canada by establishing elected legislative assemblies. These assemblies gave the people of the Canada some say in the governance of the colonies, but most power remained in the hands of an appointed legislative council and governor-general of the Canadas, who had the power to veto any legislation. The council, of course, was made up of the aristocracy, mostly British, with a few wealthy French speakers who were willing to toe the line. One later colonial minister wrote that it was at that time contemplated that an hereditary aristocracy might be formed in these provinces by attaching to the seats in the council the title of honor, which could be passed down, making it clear that power was never meant to rest in the hands of the colonists. Power remained firmly in the hands of the British leaders and the councils, who used their positions to enrich themselves in land, offices, and pensions, often at the expense of the French-speaking Canadians. Two parties emerged in Lower Canada, one British and one French. The wealthy British powers became known as the Chateau clique, who sought to assimilate the French to British culture, law, and language. In Upper Canada, where there were fewer French, power was consolidated in the Family Compact, a number of wealthy British families who monopolized political, economic, and judicial power. Both sought to ensure that the people of the provinces remained without a true voice. The Assembly did, however, manage to take control of the purse strings of the government, and were happy to use it as a bludgeon to get what they want. In Lower Canada, one of the primary leaders of the opposition to the British bureaucrats was Louis-Joseph Papineau, a French landowner and assemblyman. He wanted all governmental offices to be elected, which would give significant power to the majority French population. In January of 1832, several Montreal newspapers attacked the council, calling for its abolition and writing that the council was an incubus. Both of the newspaper editors were arrested and jailed for weeks, and later that year 3 people were shot in Montreal during a riot over an election, and no one was arrested for the killings. Papineau wrote of the killings, "The troops sent to protect His Majesty's subjects fired upon them. Canada has never before been afflicted with such miseries." Exacerbating the problem was a series of economic and medical disasters. The closing of the Bank of the United States in 1832 and the Panic of 1837 caused recession and economic upheaval. Cholera struck in 1832 and 1834, killing 10% of the population in Montreal in 1832. Problems with insects wiped out harvests, causing widespread hunger. The Canadian government continued to allow in immigrants that brought the disease and failed to provide for the huge numbers of the sick. The Bishop of Montreal complained of the invasion of our uncultivated land by British immigrants who threatened to drive us out of our country and reduce our Canadian population, year after year, by the spread of disease. One writer wrote that poverty was great and misery complete in Canada. Papineau wrote his 92 Resolutions, which was presented to the Assembly on January 7th, 1834. The Assembly passed the resolutions, which were full of its grievances against the Legislative Council. It wasn't until 1837 that the resolutions reached the King, William IV. It demanded an entirely elected government, denied the King's prerogative, and demanded the end of the oligarchy of the family compact and the chateau clique. By refusing appropriations, the Assembly had effectively brought government to a halt in Canada. Civic authority was absent, the acts governing the cities had lapsed, and there was no money for police or sanitation. Archibald Aitchison, 2nd Earl of Gosford, was made governor in an effort to solve the problem. He spoke fluent French and appointed more French in an effort at reconciliation, but the Assembly and the Council failed to compromise on reform. In 1837, the UK Parliament sent their 10 resolutions, which denied all of Papineau's demands. Patriots and Loyalists began marching opposed to one another in Montreal and Quebec. One constitutionalist wrote ominously that the French majority could be easily dealt with. Crowded as they are on the level banks of the St. Lawrence, they could be reached in almost all their settlements by the long 48-pounder gunboat. On August 18, 1837, the Lower Canadian Assembly met and once again refused to release funds. Gosford prorogued the Assembly, seizing the funds, and disbursed money owed to government employees. Gosford knew what was next. "We can now make no terms with Mr. Papineau," he said. "You must either put him down or submit to let him put you down." Tavern keepers put up American eagles over their signs, and committees of public safety began appearing. The Filles de la Liberté, or Sons of Liberty, formed in Montreal, with the goal to emancipate our country from all human authority save that of the bold democracy residing within its bosom. Papineau, however, hesitated. He made no effort to procure weapons and held back from calling for rebellion. Word came from William Lyon Mackenzie in Upper Canada that he planned to rebel on December 7th. In October, a convention dubbed the Assembly of Six Counties met. Papineau gave a speech in a surprisingly conciliatory tone, urging the others to continue to push for change peacefully. Wilfred Nelson of Saint Denis, a former military doctor and another leader of the meeting, burst out, "I differ from Mr. Papineau. The time has come to melt our spoons into bullets." Papineau had lost control of his own movement. 13 resolutions were passed, including ones to replace the nullified legislature and to train soldiers. "The time for speeches is past," said another speaker. "It is lead we will throw at our enemies." The spark came on November 6th, when members of the Sons of Liberty got into a brawl with the Loyalist Doric Club on the streets of Montreal. Nearly all of the regular forces in the Canadas were gathered, including all the British forces in Upper Canada, to quell the growing discontent. Gosford ordered the arrest of Papineau, Nelson, and other leaders. On November 17th, Patriot volunteers freed several in an attack on a prisoner wagon. On November 23rd, Patriot forces met the British at Saint Denis. Papineau, who had little stomach for battle, fled for the United States as the fight began, while Nelson commanded the defense. The British had about 300 men against double that number, but only half of Nelson's men were armed and were holed up in the town's buildings. The British had only one cannon and little ammunition and failed to dislodge the Patriots from a stone building in the middle of town. Patriot forces forced the British to flee, and they spiked their cannon when it got stuck in the mud. The British casualties were 6 dead, 10 wounded, and 6 missing, while the Patriots lost 12, with another 7 wounded. Victory was short-lived. A second British force engaged Patriots at St. Charles, south of St. Denis. Their defenses had been poorly constructed and was manned by only 200 men with only half as many rifles. The British were able to take a hill that overlooked the defenses and made short work of the defenders. "Them fellers fought well," said one British soldier. "They waited too long to run." After a bayonet charge dislodged the last defenders, 3 British were dead and 18 wounded, and at least 56 Patriots were killed. Meanwhile, on the other side of Montreal, another force was growing in Saint-Eustache, notwithstanding the bad news from St. Charles. The rebellion was already collapsing, but their hopes were alive that Papineau would return with weapons and an army of Americans. Commanded by Jean-Oliver Chenier and Amaury Giraud, they planned a daring assault on Montreal itself, having convinced themselves it was undefended. As they were mustering on the morning of the 14th, a British force appeared. Thinking it was only Loyalist locals, 200 patriots rushed off, only to find more than 1,500 British regulars. They broke immediately. The British had a Congreve rocket, long in storage, which they attempted to fire. The rocket went off, clipping a fence before making a full 360 and flying through the headquarters staff, sending them in all directions. One of the volunteers found the rocket coming after him as he ran and dove into the snow as the rocket finally flew up and exploded, killing no one. Giraud fled, claiming he was riding for reinforcements, while Chenier holed up in the church with 70 or 80 men. The British set fire to the church, forcing the surviving patriots to jump from the church windows under fire. Chenier was killed, shot through the heart as he landed. Giraud, hounded by vengeful patriots who felt he had betrayed them, would eventually take his own life. Saint-Eustache was burned to the ground. By early December, the patriots had abandoned Saint-Denis, and British burned rebel property there. Several leaders were captured as the patriots fled for the border, including Nelson on December 12th. Papineau escaped to the United States, literally crawling through the snow from his sister's house at one point. In Upper Canada, William Lyon Mackenzie's rebellion had gone on as planned. Mackenzie was a Scottish-born Canadian who had been struggling for reform against the oligarchy of the Family Compact. Mackenzie was elected Toronto's first mayor in 1834, had been elected to the Assembly beginning in 1829, although he was repeatedly expelled for criticizing the government in his newspaper. He uncovered outright fraud, where the government had sold land to members of the Family Compact at low prices, or even exchanged valuable land for less valuable land to their benefit. In 1836, the Tories were able to unseat him, and he decided that the government could only be changed with violence. As he told Papineau, he planned on starting his own rebellion on December 7th. And in November, he printed broadsheets listing grievances and handbills declaring independence. Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada Francis Bondhead dismissed the idea of a serious rebellion and refused to request to keep soldiers to defend the colony, sending all of them to deal with the rebellion in Lower Canada. He also refused to allow a militia to be called. It wasn't until December 2nd that the Loyalists in Toronto named a general of the militia. On December 4th, a group of rebels approached Toronto early in response to a warrant for Mackenzie's arrest. They gathered at Montgomery's Tavern, just north of the city, and set up a roadblock. A Loyalist officer was killed trying to reach the city, and the next day rebels attempted to arrest a Toronto alderman who killed a rebel leader before escaping to warn the city. On December 7th, a force of 1,200 Loyalist volunteers and 2 cannons marched to confront the rebels at the tavern. Mackenzie had only around 200 armed men. After a very brief gunfight, the rebels broke and fled, ending the rebellion before it accomplished anything. Mackenzie and a few hundred supporters fled to the Niagara River, where they occupied Navy Island and declared themselves the Republic of Canada. On December 29th, Canadian militia crossed the border and set fire to the U.S. ship Caroline as it had ferried the rebels, including Americans, to Navy Island, causing uproar in the United States. The rebels held on to Navy Island until mid-January, when British attacks forced them to abandon the effort. Mackenzie was soon arrested in the United States for violating the Neutrality Act, although he was pardoned shortly after. Despite overwhelming defeats, rebels and like-minded Americans didn't give up. A secret organization called the Hunters Lodge formed to support an ongoing rebellion, with support from some radical members of the Democratic Party, the Locofocos, who advocated for the end of the moneyed aristocracy. These men crossed into Canada a dozen times as part of the Patriot War, in which the rebels found enemies in both the Canadian and American governments. In Lower Canada, Robert Nelson, brother of Wolfred Nelson, took over leadership in the U.S. with American volunteers and Canadian refugees. He got a hold of 1,000 rifles and 3 cannons stolen from a militia arsenal in Elizabethtown, New York, and crossed into Canada on February 27th. A mile into Canadian territory, the group declared a new republic, with Robert Nelson its first president. But prompt resistance convinced the rebels to return to the U.S. without engagement. Nelson, briefly arrested and acquitted in the United States, took the lead again in November, when forces gathered in secret in the Hunters Lodge began another uprising, which was meant to be supported by a groundswell of local uprisings surrounding Montreal. Initially, it seemed that it might be successful. On November 3rd and 4th, hundreds of patriots had seized the matter at Beauharnois, capturing several wealthy British. And on November 8th, Patriot forces won a skirmish with Loyalist militia near Saint-Martin. British Canadian authorities had heard there were 250,000 men in the Hunters Lodge and as many as 40,000 fighting men. But the uprisings didn't happen. Near Montreal, the regions were quiet, and no force close to 40,000 appeared to invade. In Upper Canada, Nelson landed by boat, arriving at Napierville. 500 men, and with them weapons and cannon, were meant to join him by foot, but they were stopped and defeated south of Napierville at the Col. Helping to find his missing men on November 9th, Nelson marched south to find his arms in the hands of Loyalists in Odelltown. A battle ensued, but Nelson surreptitiously abandoned the fight partway through. The Patriots were soundly defeated. At Beauharnois, the 500 men began to melt away in the face of news and rumors, and British forces moved in from the north to finish them off. After only a short fight, the remainder were defeated. The final battle was fought beginning November 12th, with members of the Hunters' Lodge attempted to seize Prescott, eventually holing up in a large stone windmill. They held out for several days until bombardment by heavy cannon forced them to surrender on November 16th. After more than a year of fighting, the rebellion had puttered out. According to Joseph Scholl, author of Rebellion, The Rising in French Canada, 1837, some 13,000 people had prepared to rise, but ultimately faded back to their homes as the hopes of the rebellion were easily quashed. A handful of the leaders were hanged, while others were given the horrible fate of deportation to Australia. But Papineau and Robert Nelson were eventually granted amnesty. And despite the Patriots' defeat, the rebellions would lead to a report by the first Earl of Durham, who was briefly made Governor-General of British North America. The Durham Report, which was released in 1839, recommended a form of responsible government, as well as the union of the Canadas with the maritime provinces in order to assimilate the French Canadians. And in 1840, that resulted in the Acts of Union, which created the province of Canada. But the continued and growing desire for independence would lead to further reforms in the Canadian Confederation, the creation of the Dominion of Canada, which was described as a kingdom in its own right, on July 1st, 1867, which is today celebrated as Canada Day. Quebec honors the Patriots each year in May on National Patriots Day, and Papineau has been remembered as an important figure. His homes are National Historical Sites, and in 1937, he was named a National Historic Person. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.